Happy Monday, everyone, both social psych and psych. This week, we're going to combine our lessons. I felt like it was really pressing given what's going on in our nation right now to kind of bring some psychology to the things that we're seeing. So, obviously, knowing the protests that are happening in response to the death of George Floyd, but also Ahmaud Arbery and other things that have happened in this country, there's a lot of turmoil and there's a lot of division. And so, what I want to do is look at the academic aspect of the issues of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So we're going to talk about this in an academic context, but I think a lot of it will relate and connect to things that you're seeing and hearing both at the dinner table, but also on social media and on television. So let's just dive right in here and get started on our first lesson. So what we're really looking at, what we're going to do throughout this week is analyze different forms of prejudice, discrimination, and how they've changed over time. Okay, so obviously prejudice and discrimination don't look exactly the same in 2020 as they did in 1920, but we're going to look at how that shift has actually happened. So our big focus question is, has prejudice decreased over time? And at the end of this lesson, that'll be our discussion question for the day. So you'll post this in discussion channel. But you're going to look at, has prejudice decreased over time? Now, I just want to start by giving some basic definitions. So if you looked at the videos right after March 19th, when we had that optional learning, we did some videos and I did one, but I just want to reiterate this for folks who didn't get to see that video. So remember, there's a difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. When we think of stereotypes, we're thinking of thoughts. Okay, so these are things that people think, generalizations that they think about a group of people. When we think of prejudice, we're thinking about feelings. Okay, and these feelings are often driven by what people think. And then finally, when we think about the word discrimination, we're talking about actions, so something that people do. So here's an example, not what I believe, but this is an example. So I think, which is the stereotype, that all women are stupid. So in this example, the stereotype for this person is that all women are stupid. Therefore, I feel like they would make bad leaders. So that's their prejudice. Okay, their prejudice isn't a thought, it's not an action, it's a feeling. Because they think that women are stupid, they feel like they make bad leaders, which is why I don't vote for women politicians. That's when your stereotype and prejudice turns into discrimination. That's an action or a lack thereof, right? They are affirming that they're not going to do this because of these two things. So that's how we can kind of look at the difference between stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. So we can see that social change can both inspire and also enrage people, especially when we think about sudden social change. This can leave people feeling worried and confused, especially if they think that change is harmful in some way. So to some people, the acceptance of same-sex marriage, that came too quickly. For others, it actually took a long time. But if you see, the Supreme Court decided in Obergefell versus Hodges that same-sex couples have a constitutionally protected right to get married. So that same-sex marriage was protected under the Constitution. We also can see that not long ago, women were not accepted in the workplace. But today we see women as CEOs of prominent global and national companies. So you can see the photo up top of various female CEOs of companies that are global and national. Finally, I think it's no secret to you all, and again, tying into our protest, we know that the United States has a deep history of racial injustice against Black Americans. Yet just recently, the William and Mary Law School, which is one of the oldest and most prestigious law schools in the country, just hired their first ever African American dean. So on the eve and in the middle of all these protests and fights for equal rights, we see a very educated Black man. He used to be a law professor at the University of Virginia, which is like the number 7 law school in the country. He is now the dean of one of the top law schools in the country. So as we think about this, the question comes, does this mean, so do these three things, these three examples, does this mean that discrimination is a thing of the past? Okay. Most social psychologists would say absolutely not. They would just say it's changed, and we'll talk about that throughout this week. So the first type of prejudice that we're going to talk about is old-fashioned prejudice. Now, if you all, when you're learning about civil rights in school, or if you've just seen references or you've had grandparents talk about it, whatever the situation is, you have experienced or seen this type of prejudice. So this is obvious, overt prejudice that is considered inappropriate by most social standards today. Okay, so when we think about this type of prejudice, it's more in the past tense. If you think back to when Black Americans couldn't eat in the same diners as white Americans, drink out of the same fountains as you see in the photo here, or even ride in the same train cars as white Americans. And so, in many cases today, this type of prejudice is unacceptable. And what we've seen is, especially after the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, many groups are legally protected. And I would even argue that most people would react strongly in a negative to public racism, sexism, or even prejudice toward people with disabilities. And like I said, in the United States, we saw the civil rights movement highlighting many of this overt, old-fashioned prejudice and a legal push to make these practices unacceptable. And we have this idea that all prejudices are not equal. So some prejudices are more accepted than others. We can see media representation of overweight people that are negative, like this image from the Netflix series Insatiable. We also saw, so you can see in the photo on the left, if any of you followed that, Colorado baker who did not want to bake a cake for a gay couple. In this case, we saw that the Supreme Court affirmed that a baker can refuse to make a wedding cake for a gay couple based on the baker's religious beliefs. So if the religious beliefs of the baker are against gay couples being married, then that baker does not have to provide their service to a gay couple. And so, we see this idea that Crandall and Eshelman did a study in 2003, and they found that prejudice toward groups that people choose to join, such as a political party, right? So you choose to be Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green. That prejudice is more acceptable than prejudice towards groups that people do not belong to by choice, such as a disability or race. Okay. The question really becomes from that study is, what do you believe? So people who believe that being overweight or gay is a choice rather than biological factors feel more justified in their prejudiced attitudes. They think it's okay to be prejudiced towards those people because they're choosing to be part of that group. Whereas they might argue that it's not okay to be prejudiced against people who are not choosing to be part of a certain group. And so this brings us to a question, is everyone treated equal? And again, this is not a yes or no question. What really comes to this is, I say it's not yes or no in the sense that you will get different answers from different people. Okay. Some people argue that because old-fashioned prejudice appears to have decreased, it means that prejudice no longer exists. So they say, well, look, schools are not divided anymore, even though they kind of are, but that's a different conversation. We don't have people drinking out of different fountains. People can vote, people can own land, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of that, prejudice no longer exists. You can find many Americans who would argue that the United States offers equal opportunity to all people who live in the country. So what they might say to the Black Lives Matter protesters on the left is that Black Lives Matter is unnecessary, and they would even, some have categorized it as reverse racism. Now, that becomes really problematic because in order to have racism, you have to have a power imbalance, meaning that someone has to be treating a race or group of people in a negative way and using their power to enforce that, okay? For example, if a Black judge had a prejudice against white men, if he sentenced them to the max sentence he could, no matter what their crime was, that could be considered racist. Okay, he's using his power in an institution to enforce his prejudice. The problem is we often don't see that level of power imbalance between Black men and white men because of the history of racism in our nation and how hard it is for an African American to get to that. You can even say the same for Hispanic Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so reverse racism is not making a joke. It's not Black Lives Matter. That there's no such thing as reverse. It's just straight up racism, no matter what. That would have to involve a power imbalance, and someone is using their power to enact their prejudice. Okay, so that's really the key with racism there. We also saw in the election of Donald Trump, hundreds of thousands of women around the country marched in demonstrations the day after the inauguration to protest what they thought were sexist policies endorsed by Trump. Others argued that sexism is no longer a problem in this country, and that women have nothing to complain about. So we can really see that there's this divide over old-fashioned prejudice is gone, so prejudice doesn't exist, and then old-fashioned prejudice is gone, but it still exists in some forms. Okay, and the main idea here is that old-fashioned prejudice is obvious, overt prejudice that would generally be considered inappropriate by today's standards. And even though this form of prejudice has decreased, many social psychologists and other in other professions would say that it's just been replaced by other more subtle forms of prejudice. We will look at two of those for the remainder of this week. So I hope you engage in this discussion post today, and I look forward to talking with you in the next lesson.